One thing that is important to understand is that Iran does not operate according to the timelines or demands set by the United States. We saw this clearly when Trump would publicly demand that Iran respond by a certain date or within a specific time frame. Iran would often wait and respond only after that deadline had passed. This was not a sign of hesitation. It was a deliberate message that Iran would not allow Washington to dictate the pace of its decisions or make it appear that pressure was controlling its actions. This approach comes from decades of experience in dealing with the United States. Iran understands that in international politics, perception is extremely important. If Washington believes that pressure is causing Iran to back down, it may become even more aggressive. Unfortunately, one of the repeated lessons from Iran's history with the United States is that whenever Iran has shown goodwill or flexibility, Washington has often interpreted that as weakness rather than as an effort to build trust. Because of this history, Iran has become very cautious in its dealings with the United States. It wants to avoid creating any impression that it is acting out of fear or surrendering under pressure. Diplomacy requires patience, confidence, and careful calculation, especially when dealing with a much stronger global power. Another major issue is the language of agreements. Iranian diplomats must examine every word carefully, because the United States has powerful allies and significant influence around the world. Any unclear wording or loophole in a document could later be used against Iran. For this reason, Iran believes it cannot afford mistakes when negotiating with Washington. Every detail matters because past experiences have shown that agreements can become a source of future disputes. This caution is not without reason. Iran's experience with previous agreements has shaped the way it approaches negotiations today. A clear example is the nuclear agreement, known as the JCPOA. From Iran's perspective, it was not Iran that abandoned the commitments of that agreement. Instead, the United States, under the Trump administration, withdrew from the deal and later imposed new sanctions. Iran argues that it had continued to fulfill its obligations, something that was repeatedly confirmed through inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. This history has created deep mistrust between the two countries. Iran believes that if an agreement contains unclear language or weaknesses, those weaknesses could eventually be exploited. Therefore, Iranian negotiators have to be extremely precise and careful. They cannot simply rely on political promises. They must ensure that every commitment, every condition, and every responsibility is clearly defined. At the same time, diplomacy is always a complicated process. A country like Iran has to consider not only the United States but also America's European allies and its wider network of partnerships in the region. Any agreement must be strong enough to protect Iran's interests in a much larger geopolitical environment. This is why Iranian officials often approach negotiations with a high level of caution. Their concern is not only about reaching an agreement today, but also about what that agreement could mean years later. A single sentence written incorrectly, or a vague term left open, could create serious problems in the future. So when critics describe Iran's careful approach as unnecessary resistance or a lack of willingness to negotiate, that interpretation ignores the historical experiences that have influenced Iran's decisions. From Iran's viewpoint, caution is not an obstacle to diplomacy, it is a necessary strategy for protecting its position. Another important point is that negotiations between Iran and the United States have never taken place in a normal environment of equal trust. The relationship has been shaped by decades of conflict, sanctions, political pressure, and competing strategic interests. Because of this background, every statement and every action is carefully analyzed by both sides. Iran believes that showing too much flexibility, without receiving reliable guarantees in return, could create a situation where it makes concessions, while the other side gains additional leverage. This is why Iranian policymakers focus so heavily on maintaining balance. They understand that diplomacy requires compromise, but they also believe that compromise without protection can become a disadvantage. For Iran, the goal is not simply to reach an agreement quickly. The goal is to reach an agreement that can survive political changes and prevent future misunderstandings. The experience of the nuclear deal remains one of the biggest factors influencing this mindset. When a major agreement can be changed or abandoned after a change in administration, it creates doubts about how dependable future commitments will be. Iran's concern is that it could fulfill its obligations while facing new demands or restrictions later. Therefore, Iranian negotiators try to ensure that any future agreement includes clear responsibilities for all parties involved. They believe that words written on paper are not enough unless there are mechanisms that prevent one side from ignoring its commitments. From this perspective, Iran's careful approach is not simply about delaying negotiations or refusing cooperation. It comes from a belief that history has shown the dangers of entering agreements without strong protections. For Iran, maintaining independence and avoiding miscalculations are central principles when dealing with a powerful opponent like the United States. A major challenge in any negotiation between Iran and the United States is the difference in how both sides view power and pressure. The United States often believes that economic sanctions and political pressure can force its opponents to change their behavior. However, Iran views this strategy differently. From Iran's perspective, accepting demands under pressure would only encourage more pressure in the future. This is why Iran tries to show that it cannot simply be pushed into decisions through threats or deadlines. The message it wants to send is that negotiations must happen through mutual respect and a recognition of each side's interests. Without that balance, Iran believes any agreement will remain fragile and vulnerable to future disagreements. Another factor is the broader regional environment. Iran is not negotiating in isolation. Its decisions are influenced by developments across the Middle East, by relationships with other countries, and by the actions of the United States and its allies in the region. This makes every diplomatic decision more complex because even a small change can have consequences beyond the negotiating table. For Iranian officials, the lesson from past experiences is that trust must be built through actions, not only through words. Promises and statements are important, but they must be supported by practical steps that demonstrate commitment. Ultimately, Iran's position comes from a belief that a strong negotiation requires preparation, patience, and careful attention to detail. The country does not want to repeat what it considers past mistakes, where agreements were reached but later challenged or abandoned. That is why Iran approaches discussions with caution, believing that protecting its long-term interests is just as important as reaching an immediate agreement. The central issue then is not simply whether Iran is willing to negotiate. The real question is whether both sides can create a framework where commitments are respected, and where neither side believes it can gain an advantage by exploiting weaknesses in an agreement. From Iran's perspective, previous experiences have shown that a deal without strong guarantees can create more problems than solutions. This is why Iranian officials remain extremely careful when dealing with the United States. They understand that diplomacy requires flexibility, but they also believe that flexibility must be combined with caution. A country cannot protect its interests if it ignores the lessons of its past. When looking at Iran's approach, it is important to consider the history behind its decisions. The delays, the careful wording, and the refusal to accept outside deadlines are not random actions. They are part of a broader strategy shaped by years of dealing with pressure and uncertainty. Iran believes that showing patience and maintaining a firm position prevents the other side from misunderstanding its intentions. In its view, weakness does not create better negotiations. It often creates greater demands. At the same time, successful diplomacy requires both sides to recognize each other's concerns. Agreements can only last when there is a genuine commitment to follow through on promises. Without that foundation, even carefully written documents can collapse when political circumstances change. So the criticism that Iran's cautious approach is simply resistance or unwillingness to cooperate does not fully consider the experiences that have shaped its policies. From Iran's perspective, caution is not a rejection of diplomacy. It is a way of ensuring that diplomacy produces a stable and lasting outcome, rather than another temporary agreement that eventually breaks down. In the end, every successful negotiation depends on trust, consistency, and respect between the parties involved. Without those elements, even the most carefully written agreements can fail. Iran's approach is shaped by its past experiences and its belief that protecting its interests requires patience and careful decision-making. Whether one agrees with this strategy or not, understanding the reasons behind it is essential to understanding the broader dynamics between Iran and the United States.